Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your interest in my work. I hope you're not going to be disappointed. There's no coding, no computers involved in anything I'm going to talk to you about, because I'm a chemist as background, and I'm going to hopefully show you some chemistry and biotechnology in the work that we're doing. And my own interest in this comes from background in chemistry. In chemistry, we create value by making products. BASF makes polymers, Roche makes drugs. We sell products, physical products to, let's say, the end consumer. And we've seen over the last years how much money can be made with not selling any products from companies who only sell information. And of course, we are intrigued by that. How can we use chemistry to play also in this world of information? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about, our, let's say, attempts of doing that, because we also see that it's also much more profitable to only sell information. There's not all of the, let's say, pain of shipping goods to and fro that goes with traditional products. So the problem I'm looking at is storing digital information. And our world has become really good in getting data more and more dense into going from paper, where we need whole libraries to store stuff and to access them, to having really small memory sticks where we have many gigabytes of data, thousands of books in a memory stick. But on the other side, while we have, let's say, this increase in density, we've lost stability of that data. Books in libraries, we know if there's no fire, no flood, they're stable there for 500 years. Our memory stick, we also kind of know that we have it living around for a year, 2 or 3. The, let's say, probability that the data is still on there perfectly is not very high. And let's say these devices were also made specific for different storage horizons. That's also something, let's say, if we have products that were made in the past, at least traditionally, they were made for very long storage horizons, for very long usage horizons. So this Breguet watch from the 18-somethings, it still works today. I don't think you're expecting that your Apple Watch is still going to work in 200 years. That's, I think, or your IKEA cupboard. You don't buy it with the idea that your great-grandson will still be using that as a cupboard. So that's something we see in our world. Still, we're really interested in this stability and compactness of data, in being able to combine those two. Because, for example, there's this artist, he printed Wikipedia or part of it just to show, let's say, this contrast between physical media we are used to and, let's say, the digital media we use every day. And this is very different to biology, because in biology, data is really stable and really compact. So this is a piece of a horse foot that was buried somewhere near Alaska. So this horse died 700,000 years ago. And from this small piece drilled from the bone of the foot, scientists could recover the full genome of that horse after 700,000 years of storage. And that full genome is about 0.5 gigabyte of information, of digital information, if we think of how much information. And that's really in contrast to, let's say, this challenge of, let's say, getting digital data into compact and long last. So that's why we are interested in, let's say, this form of storing data in biological molecules, especially in DNA. Because DNA in, let's say, the chemical space is really unique, because we have extremely powerful tools of accessing it, of reading it, of detecting it. And just to make you understand that, and nowadays I think everybody knows DNA and RNA. Through COVID, everybody knows if we have one virus in the back of our throat, we're able to detect it and say that's a coronavirus. And that's very different to all other chemicals and their detection systems. If we want to detect gold atoms, we need enormous machines and thousands of gold atoms at the same time to be able to say that's gold. So DNA is really unique, that we are really good, have good tools of being able to detect that molecule and also being able to read the sequence in that molecule as well. That's, let's say, sequential biopolymer, but we'll get into that in a moment. Or let's say, just as I don't know what your biochemical background is of understanding what DNA is. DNA is really, in our body, a really long molecule that has these two sides, and along those sides arranged are 4 different bases, which we call A, C, T, and G, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and they have an arrangement. So this is, now I have to be careful, that G, T, C, A, that's, let's say, the information that runs along that strand. And in that very long strand in our body is encoded our genome. That's how, and that we inherit to our kids, where we mix woman's and man's genome together to scramble those two together to create a new genome. That's how it works in biology. And let's say this idea, if we think about storing data in computers or in text, and how biology does that, is the same. Kind of, we as humanity kind of invented storing data, zeros and ones, before we found out that biology actually does it that way. That, let's say, this logical way of arranging, let's say, bits or ACTGs, let's say, onto each other. This was developed long before we even found out how that works in biology. It's let's say, a logical way of being able to do that. And we'll come back to that afterwards, but I think everybody can imagine that you could go and say you translate this to that by some idea. Everybody can come up with their own, let's say, coding, how you would do that. We usually use 00 is A, because we have twice the number of possibilities for ACTG than we have for bits. 00 is A, 01 is C, 10 is G, and 11 is T. You can come up with your own way of translating that, but I think we can agree that we can, let's say, translate these two things into each other. So this idea of using DNA as a data storage technology came up really early, just after the development or the discovery how this DNA molecule really looked like and how it worked in biology. First scientists, famous real scientists, Wiener and then a Russian, Neumann. And there's, let's say, this interview from 1964 from Norbert Wiener, and more or less it says, in other words, instead of magnetic tape as a memory core of a computer, you will have genes. So the idea of using that is old as the discovery of DNA. Just at the time, it wasn't possible to read and write genes or DNA. And so I'm going to tell you a little how this has evolved over time. Then there's this wonderful work by an artist. He wrote the micro Venus. So this, let's say, art signature, ancient art signature. He wanted to write into, let's say, A, C, T, and G. He had some way of encoding it, and first by writing it in binary form, which kind of looks like the shape, then encoding that into A, C, T, and G. And at the time, let's say 30 years ago, that was kind of the amount of information that was practical to be put into, let's say, bacteria, for example, and with a lot of effort that was put into bacteria. Little after that, a group showed that you could send short messages in DNA, so they could synthesize short DNA strands and also read them. You see the read signal here. This is Sanger sequencing. So you're reading this, let's say, long sequence of A, C, T, and Gs using 4 colors to encode the 4 different bases in the reading. And they use this text of June 6th invasion Normandy as an example of kind of James Bond-like research of, let's say, using DNA as a unique tool to be able to communicate and send such messages. Now, relatively recently, about 10 years ago, 2 groups at the same time showed that you can store a megabyte of data in DNA. That kind of, let's say, pushed really this field of DNA research on. One of them, by the way, the left, Nick Goldman, he comes from the European Bioinformatics Institute, and the European Bioinformatics Institute stores human genomes. So he usually has the task of taking human or animal genome data and storing it digitally. And he sees all the effort he has to go through doing that and how, let's say, practical the biological solution is, and then try to go the other way and take digital data, text, translate it, and store it as a DNA molecule. And I'm going to show you, let's say, how this works, because the tools we need to be able to do that, we have to read and write DNA. And writing DNA, as a chemist, that's a little like building Lego. We have these 4 building blocks, A, C, T, and G, and in the end, we are kind of just plugging them together. We buy those 4 building blocks. They're commercially available. There's other chemists that make them, and we kind of stack them in any way we want them on top of each other. It doesn't quite look as simple as that, because with chemistry, we usually have pools or reactants, and this is run on the surface of a small bead. So you have a bead, you attach one base to the bead, then you cleave off a protection group that prevents that you have polymerization of that, let's say, molecule. And in cycles, you're adding one base after the other to make any molecule you want. We have limitations in that. We can't make very long DNA. Like in our body, we have millions of bases stacked to each other. This technology can make like 200 bases we can stack on top of each other in any way we want. So we can write DNA. And nowadays, we can also do that in parallel. On chips, we can synthesize many DNA molecules at the same time, each of them 200 bases long. I will show a little bit later into the details of that. We can also read DNA. I've shown you before this example of Sanger sequencing, where you can take a single molecule, let's say, DNA molecule, and you read the sequence. You take dyed bases which bind to the original sequence, and then you detect that in some specific way developed in many years of technological innovation. More recently, we can not only do that on one molecule, but on the chip surface, we sequence millions of molecules at the same time, millions of different molecules at the same time. So you take a big surface, you bind different molecules to different positions on the chip, and again, using color technology, you're able to detect by taking photographs of that surface at different steps of that detection process. We are able to read the sequences of millions of DNA molecules at the same time. All of this technology was developed for sequencing human body, for medicine. That's we want to know, we want to understand the human genome, we want to know how cancer acts, how specific drugs work depending on genetic mutations. That's why all of this technology was developed. But we are really good at reading DNA. And something that connects us with computer science is how quickly, let's say, innovation was made in this technology, where you see Moore's law as, let's say, the rate of change or improvement that, let's say, our world has kind of seen as a really high rate of improvement of a technology. And the cost of sequencing genomes has dropped orders of magnitude faster than, let's say, Moore's law has, let's say, pushed computer development. And especially this is by innovation. This is where, let's say, in the past, this is measuring single molecules and then, let's say, optimizing, making it better. And here we really have innovation where, as I told you, there are these chip technologies where millions of molecules can be measured at the same time. And today, you can go to your doctor and more or less for $100, he'll put his margin on, and whoever, other people, you can have your full genome sequenced. Something that 20 years ago would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So really, let's say, in our lifetime, from essentially impossible to being a commodity, this technology has become available to our world. And of course, we cannot only use that for reading our genome. We can also use that to read synthetic DNA or information we have written before. But something I'm really interested in is the stability of DNA, because there's, let's say, a misconception in the scientific world also, or also in the public image. Because on one side, I've shown you that image of the horse before. There's another image, even older, 1 million years old tooth from a mammoth, where DNA has been recovered. So DNA is really stable. And on the other side, if you talk to a biologist in the lab, he'll tell you DNA, we always have to have it in the freezer, otherwise it'll just decompose. So we have to be really careful. So if you look at instructions on how to store DNA in your lab, it has to be extremely cold. And you might say that this mammoth was also really cold. That's true for this mammoth, but there are samples, 300,000-year-old samples that were stored at 10 degrees, and we're still able to read them. So it's not just the temperature that, let's say, makes this difference. And so we were intrigued by this and wanted to understand what's the difference of that tooth in the mammoth, and let's say, because yes, just here, this is the decay at room temperature after a year. Only 10% of the DNA is left, and if you have it cold, it's there for a very long time. And in preventing decay, we have 3 technologies. Let's say if we go to the kitchen, also we have 3 technologies for preventing decay. 2 are usually used. We put it into the freezer. Second, we put it in a tin can to prevent reaction of our food with oxygen and water and other molecules, light that might damage our food stuff. And with DNA, we might want to do the same. And for DNA, we also see we have these ancient fossils, and it's perhaps the engulfing of the DNA in something solid, such as the tooth or the bone, that creates that stability. So with DNA, that's what people do. That's, by the way, a global DNA vault somewhere upside in Norway, where it's really cold, and let's say seeds are preserved for future generations. But with DNA, we can just put it into a freezer. There's a company, Imagen, they sell these small tubes where you put DNA inside and you fill them with argon, so the DNA can't react with oxygen or water. And what I'm interested in, let's say fossilization, where we engulf the DNA in something solid so it can't react with anything. And I'll just show you through that technology, because that's what we are really interested in and have developed. We take a small glass nanoparticle, we change the surface charge to positive. DNA is a very negatively charged molecule, so if we add it in solution to those nanoparticles, it binds to the surface of that glass nanoparticle, then has a negative charge, the surface of the particle, due to the DNA. We take this small molecule, which on one side has the positive charge and will bind to the negative DNA, and on the other side, it kind of looks like glass. Glass is SiO2. So here it's SiO and then some organic remainder. So it kind of looks like glass on the outside. And we then take this molecule, which even more looks like glass, and this then kind of polymerizes on the surface of that first molecule to build glass on the outside of the DNA. So as chemists, I know it's very unusual for everybody thinking in a physical way, where you would say you have to melt glass to be able to form it. As chemists, we can make glass in aqueous solution by using these chemicals. We only have to direct it where we want it to grow, and so we can grow a little glass. We can't make windows, but we can make a few nanometers of glass using this technology. And so in the end, we expect that we have our DNA, glass in the inside, glass in the outside, and the DNA is protected against reaction with water, oxygen, anything it might react with. These are electron micrograph images. These are the particles. I told you they're relatively small, 100 nanometers. And on top of the DNA, we grow a thin layer of glass, and inside we have the DNA molecules. We were able to show that the DNA in those particles, we measure the stability. We want to predict the stability. We don't want to wait for hundreds, thousands of years or thousands of years. So we do accelerated aging. We assume that we heat it up in a controlled way. It'll decay faster in a controlled way. From that, we can predict its room temperature stability. If we do that prediction, the stability of the DNA in our glass particles is very similar to the stability that's known for DNA in fossil bone. So we have transformed the molecule, which we can read and write, which before this was not really useful outside of, let's say, biology, into something where we have it in these particles and we can really use it as a, let's say, everyday tool, because we've really made it stable. And we can do storage with it. We can read, write, and we can store it. I'll quickly go a little deeper into the storage. We have some constraints if we want to do storage with DNA. One, I already told you, we can't read and write very long strands. We only can do 200 MERS. We might have errors within the strands. We might have a loss of whole strands. And there might be structure in our information which inhibit the reading process. And so various computer scientists have helped us in solving these issues. One is to get away of the structure, we multiply the information with a known random number, so the information loses its structure. And then to solve the problem of the limited length, we write many short oligos, and in each oligo we put a number, which is kind of the order of that has in the pool. And to go into that a little deeper, so there's an encoding step, then the DNA is synthesized. I didn't tell you before, one amazing tool of DNA is that we can amplify it. If we have one copy of a DNA molecule or of a DNA pool, within an hour we can make billions of copies of that molecule, which is really, really powerful because you can't do that with any other, let's say, physical information carrier in that fast way. Then we can store it, sequence it, and decode it again. And I want to, because I assume that's something you're closer to, talk a little more about the encoding strategy we have. So we take digital information, we split it up in just short lines. So blacks are 0, whites are 1, which is structure the information into small blocks. Then we randomize it by a given random number. And then we introduce error correction coding to prevent error loss. We have an outer code that protects against the loss of individual sequences. We expect that in the future, individual of those strands will become individual sequences. So we add error correction codes to protect against loss of those sequences. And then, I apologize for that. Just a second. Let me take this away. I don't know what I did. I hope now it's complete. That's unprofessional. Yeah, perhaps. What else do I have there hidden away? No. Yeah, I took away in the intermediate slide and then kind of got lost. We also then index the information. It also shifted everything. Add an outer code which protects against errors in individual sequences, and then we translate these individual sequences to sequences of DNA by encoding A, C, T, and G. So I hope even with the glitch, I can convince that we do this quite as you would do that in, let's say, data storage, in other data storage means using error correction coding capabilities to prevent against error loss. And this next slide, then we can synthesize the DNA. At the moment, there's 3 technologies that allow the synthesis of million different DNA oligos at the same time, because that's a real chemical challenge. Because usually in chemistry, we have a pot and we make one molecule in the pot. But here we have to make millions of different molecules at the same time. And ideally for that, we don't want to use millions of different pots when every pot we want to make a different molecule. So the challenge we have, or the world has in this, is how small can you make a chemical reaction? How can you direct a chemical reaction that on one instance of a space, a reaction happens, and the next instance it doesn't happen, or a different reaction happens, because I want to introduce a different base aside it. And the 3 technologies that are used to do that are either by inkjet printing, which I think is pretty easy to imagine. They have an inkjet printer, and it just prints on the surface. You have many, let's say, spots, and you add the base you want to the spot you want it introduced. That's technology that's commercialized, and it's a spin-off, I think, of Epson or HP originally, which are experts in inkjet printing technology, for DNA synthesis. So really, let's say, having phase-small reactors in small droplets made by printing heads. The second technology is by electrochemical synthesis. So we take an electrode surface where we can create protons by electricity on every spot on that. And protons for us in chemists is acid generation. So we can create acid as a function of space on the surface. And then chemists come up with synthesis steps which are dependent on acids. So if I have an acid, if I have a surface with some DNA strands on top, and they won't continue growth until they have seen an acid. So I can have the surface, and on specific sites on the surface, I electrochemically induce the acid formation and make the DNA strand reactive. Then I add base A, and that DNA strand will add an A. Then I do that somewhere else for the next base, and with that I can make many different chemical reactions at the same time. And the same idea can be done not with acids, but using light, where I have chemistry, I have all of these strands, they're all blocked by a molecule that's dependent on light. So if I add light, that blockage falls away, and then I can introduce my next base only there where I shine light to. So those are the three ways with which we can miniaturize DNA synthesis. This is an example using this light-directed synthesis, which has the lowest cost, but lowest cost and poorest fidelity. We are, of course, interested in the lowest cost, not in the poor fidelity, but we're able to show that using error correction codes, we can overcome that poor fidelity, because let's say our error probability for substitution is 2%, for deletion and insertion is like 6%. So if you look at these sequences, only, let's say, every million sequence is correct. All others, they have errors in them. And so we have to use first clustering of these reads. We usually have multiple outcomes for every read. We read the sequences usually a few times. We do alignment, weighted extraction, and then error correction coding. And at the end, we can recover the file perfectly if we induce the right amount of error correction to that. And here we store like 100 kilobytes of some music into that. What I want to show you, this really works. We can really read, write, and store data in DNA. Kilobytes, megabytes. Microsoft has worked on this. They've done 100 megabytes, even a gigabyte. Perhaps the 100 megabytes for sure. So this is reality. And to show you the advantages of why one would do that, I like this image. This is these glass particles we make with DNA inside on the top of a DVD. And in the DVD, you see these holes. And as far as I understand, every hole is about 1 bit, a little more. There's some coding on the length of the hole and so on. But what I do know quite precisely, in every of these small particles, there's enough DNA for storing 10,000 bits. So in this image, we have 160 bits on a DVD and about 1 million bits stored in DNA. So really showing, let's say, this capacity this brings as a tool. So in general, if we go this way, we can go to DNA in these particles. They have about 1,000 years half-life, the stability of the DNA in that, and by error correction, we can know that we can read it after at least 500 years, and we get insane data densities, as I've shown you in that image before. So I hope that I've shown you why we would use DNA as a data storage tool. There are these two advantages. But there's also a very wide reason why we wouldn't do that, and that it's really expensive. At the moment, let's say, if we do project, it's perhaps $1,000 per megabyte to write. Read is perhaps 100 per megabyte, probably less, 10, depends on what you owe. It's really expensive. So there are people thinking about this using in archival storage and accepting, well, the floppy disk was also just a megabyte 50 years back, I don't know, 30 years back, and now it's involved into, let's say, really accessible. And perhaps this will also evolve in that way, and we'll get this to archival storage. Me, myself, I'm interested in a different aspect of that. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the next few minutes, is DNA is really unique as a tool. It's not really good at storing a lot of data, but we can do things with it we can't do with any other data carrier. So we are interested in, let's say, using those applications which are unique to DNA and try to implement them without having to use millions of megabytes or in those applications. And the easiest one for that is what we call product paternity test or product barcoding. Because if I take just one DNA strand, and one DNA strand is really cheap to make synthetically, I can put a barcode into that. And because it's DNA, and in these particles, I can mix it into a product. So I can put information into any product, essentially. I can put it into a polymer, and I can, let's say, put information into objects. Kind of, we can put it, as we are in Switzerland, perhaps in a Swiss Army knife, and then kind of do a PCR test at the end and ask the Swiss Army knife, are you a Victorinox Swiss Army knife or a Wenger Swiss Army knife? So you can ask the product questions, not on the label, not on the outside, not as a QR code added to it, really inside of the object. And this is really what's enabled using DNA. We've done that with a few examples. We've looked at food, because with food, we spend more money on food when we know where it comes from. We spend more money on Italian pasta than pasta from somewhere else. We spend significantly more money on Italian olive oil. The world sells, I think, 2 or 3 times as much extra virgin Italian olive oil that Italy produces. That's a fact. So there might be incentive for the Italian olive oil manufacturers to protect the olive oil by putting barcodes into that product. That works. We can show that really, because we are so sensitive in measuring DNA, we need really minute amounts of the DNA to put that information into the product. As a consumer, you might say, well, perhaps I don't want DNA in my food. And there's, of course, processes we have to go through to enable that in food, to, let's say there's perhaps more, the risk of the product is lower than the value you can create from that. But 2 of my students, they have commercialized this technology. The company is called Helixer, and at the moment they're not focusing on food, but on textiles and precious materials. So they put the barcodes into the textile at the point of origin to protect fair trade, bio, cotton, other, let's say, elements of that. And then DNA has to survive they've shown that it survives the whole processing step, and you can buy a t-shirt, and in the textile, it's written where the cotton comes from. Or in this case, this is a commercial implication where fair trade cashmere, of course, is a high value product, that this really comprises cashmere that was sourced in, let's say, the proper fair trade environment. And quite recently, the spin-off company has collaborated with C&A. I think that's something we see as consumers. C&A, H&M, they're selling fair trade and, let's say, supply chain. Here, I don't think they're going to sell it to the end customer, but these large corporations want to ensure that they understand their own supply chain, because often the head of the company doesn't understand how their supply chain works and can't work through it, and there are risks in that they want to mitigate by understanding the supply chain better. So this is kind of just putting a barcode in. But then we have the problem that we have a disconnect between our objects we have and, let's say, their digital, let's say, information. Usually you can have a barcode, and then you can connect the, let's say, physical object and the digital information. And that's very different to biology, where in biology, let's say, there's a real connection between the genome, the information, and the product. It's fully defined. If you have a piece of the product, you know where it comes from. There was this horse meat scandal in the UK, where they sold horse meat as cow's meat. Genetically, you can measure that very easily, because it's written into the cow's meat that it's cow's meat, and the opposite for horse meat. And what we want to do is do the same with products. So we want to put actual information into products, not just barcodes. And DNA is, I think, a really useful tool to be able to do that, because we know we can put barcodes into products. We know we can read and write information in DNA. We can do kilobytes of that without a lot of effort. And so we believe that in the future we'll have what we call DNA of things, that things have their own information embedded inside of them. And I'll show you a few examples of where we think that might be useful or playful at the moment, I would say. Mainly, I want to show these as things which are not possible with other storage media. One is 3D printing. So this is a 3D printed Stanford bunny, something that many people print when they buy a 3D printer. And in the bunny encoded is the file from which the bunny was printed. So one can go, take a piece of the bunny, clip the ear off, get out the DNA, sequence it, and print more copies of the same bunny without having to go to, of course, much more practical to go to a website and download the file and print the bunny. But here it's to be able to show that exactly as we do in biology, we can, as some animals, they self-replicate just by, let's say, reproducing from their own genome. We can create copies of the original object without needing digital repository of that. So we can distribute and share information in a different way using DNA as we do with others. We can make transparent data carriers. So these are glasses. They have the DNA of a movie stored in the glasses. Also something, all other data carriers are not non-transparent. They're all black or gray or something, let's say, intransparent. And so we can put information to commodity products together with a newspaper. Last year, we printed the Germany's constitution, they call it Grundgesetz, in the ink of a newspaper. So that was to celebrate 75 years of the German constitution. We translated the German constitution into DNA, put it into the printing ink. They printed a full edition of the newspaper, 400,000 copies. We buy the newspaper, and in a small dot of text, we can extract the full German law from that. Again, not practical. Why would you do that? But it shows this power that DNA has in making copies, in distributing it, in being super sensitive, in being able to read it back. Something you might be able to relate to is the album Mezzanine from Massive Attack. They came to us and said, well, we would like to store this album in DNA. We really like this DNA stuff. It's fancy. We would like to do that. So we did that with them. We compressed it to, I think, 15 megabytes. Then ordered DNA, let's say, translated to DNA. You get this long sequence of DNA. We order the DNA. And then we have this DNA, and even we put it into the particles, it's a super boring white powder. And then the idea was we would go to a concert of them and give them, let's say, their CD in DNA. And it was so boring. And then we thought, well, we will have to make something more interesting out of it. And one of the artists, of the musicians, is also a graffiti artist. So we decided to make a graffiti paint out of it, just by mixing these particles into graffiti. And then the artist can paint with his music, kind of. Really, literally, in, let's say, what he paints is the music stored in that. Again, you need a lab. Not everybody can do that, but it's a new way of using technology. In the larger sense, same idea. For Netflix, we stored a whole episode, also compressed, because as I told you, synthesis and storage is expensive. So here we really, let's say, this is not 8K, but really compressed so that we can do that in a smart way. I only have 2 minutes left, and I want to show you something different to this, because I find it so interesting, and that's randomness. And cryptography theory of randomness and physical objects. I don't know how common knowledge that is. These are physical unclonable functions, or physical one-way functions. They're physical items which are random and non-clonable. So they're made in a random process. And then you create an input function that creates a unique signal that's unique to that object. This first implementation is a piece of tinted glass, or tinted milk glass, milky glass. If you shine a laser into it, it creates a speckle pattern. And that speckle pattern is unique to the piece of glass. And you can't recreate the piece of it. It's just random, let's say, pattern of small, let's say, inconsistencies in the glass that break the laser beam. And with DNA, we are extremely good at making randomness. I told you we can make DNA sequences if we want, in, let's say, defined sequences. But we are even better in making whatever sequence we want. If we just add the 4 bases together at the same time, we just get a random mix of these 4 bases in sequences. And then if we do that, and we order a pool of that, we have, let's say, 7 million gigabytes of randomness in a few microliters of water, which I think is really unique of having such a high density of uniqueness. And we can not only make that, we can also access it. Because we have, let's say, an input function, which is like PCR, which will amplify out only one of those sequences. We don't know which one of those sequences it will amplify, but we can have an input function that uniquely to the random pool creates a given output function. This is what, let's say, the random pool would look like. And then we have two inputs. Inputs are, let's say, also DNA we add to the pool, some primers we add. And depending on the primer, if we do primer pair 1, we twice get this outcome. Primer pair B, we twice get a completely different outcome. And from the outcome, we can't relate back to what input that was. Excellent. And that we can use, kind of skip that, in, let's say, authentifying objects, because we can put defined randomness, we can distribute defined randomness in different objects, and every one of them can execute a one-way function, but only if you have this, let's say, that physical object. So I'm a few seconds over time. I hope I could show you DNA is really unique in the whole chemical world of what we can do with it. It can be encapsulated and it's protected from water. We can use it to represent either digital information. I shortly covered that we can also be interested in entropy, in random information, and we think it's really useful as a data storage tool. Perhaps not in replacing storage tools we already have, but thinking about completely differently on how we want to distribute information, usually in connection with some products, because I think that's the physicality of this data carrier really relates very well to that. With that, thanks very much for your attention, and depending on time and everything, yeah.